for the kind invitation. Let me maybe clarify first that, of course, this evening I'm not speaking for the institution, I'm speaking for myself, and that maybe allows it also to be a little bit more, let's say, outspoken and interesting. So I've been invited to speak about global trends and the European Union. And sometimes it's interesting when we take the long view to just have a look what is happening right now. So what has happened in the last months, which might clarify us a little bit on where we are going. And in fact, this year has been already full of events. First, let's not forget that on the 1st of January, finally, Brexit was completed, with the transitional period being over. And I think it's honest to say that this has been weakening the European Union. We've become smaller, we've become less powerful. There's much less security expertise. There's less economic power. But I think it's also fair to say that the first months have been showing that this hasn't been without problems for Britain as well. Not only on the border, but we also have some old demons coming back. And that especially in Northern Ireland in the last days, where, let's say, images have reoccurred which remind us of what was called, maybe a little bit too nicely, the era of troubles. But going beyond that, on the 6th of January, something happened which most of us would never have assumed would be possible, which is that an angry mob stormed the United States Capitol, incited by the still sitting president, and tried to stop the completion of the democratic election process of the United States president, which was just during that hour to be completed and to be certified. That's something which is unheard of and which is very troubling when we are thinking about the leading country of the West. And thirdly, the main Russian opposition politician, Navalny, was arrested, and the reason was that he left Russia in a coma after he was poisoned by state organs. And he's now in a prison and in very dire state. And moving to the last days, let us also not forget that right now, 80,000 Russian troops are very close to the Ukrainian border in the northeast, in the east, and also on the Crimea. And NATO is very much alarmed. And we all know very well the importance of Ukraine for a safe and secure Europe. So the question is, are these all isolated events which we should look at in separation, or do these events have something in common? I think it is fair to say that the strategic position of the European Union and its member states over the last 30 years has fundamentally changed. I remember that Chancellor Kohl was very proud to say after German unification that Germany, and in extension also the European Union, was just surrounded by friends. And it was true in 1990. I think it would be very difficult nowadays to say the same things. Maybe it would be better to say that the European Union nowadays is surrounded by trouble. From the east, the very aggressive Russia, problems with Turkey, in the south, and also difficult relations with Brexit, Britain. So the European Union is challenged. It's challenged by states, by Russia, to a certain degree also by China, and it surely was also by the US administration under Donald Trump, but also by rich individuals. And that's something which we normally don't look at in these foreign relations. It's interesting that one family, the Mercer family, both co-sponsored Brexit, co-sponsored also the Trump America First campaign, also held important stakes in Parler, which served the people storming the Capitol for communication. Basically following an agenda which was anti-state, anti-climate change legislation, pro-weapons and low taxes. So the challenges are not only coming from states, they are also coming from rich private individuals. Most aggressive is probably Russia. The security services in the United States have clearly expressed that there was an attempt by Russia to manipulate the 2016 presidential elections. We all know that the emails of presidential candidate Clinton were hacked. And Russia is producing, in a kind of industrial way, social media content, which is then used in public debates. There's one of the leading 10 historians in the world, Timothy Snyder, who is saying, I don't know whether correctly, that about 20% of the social media content that was floating during the Brexit debate, in fact, was produced over there. The aim is clear. For Russia, it's much more difficult to deal with the European Union as a bloc than with, in the past, 28 or today 27 individual member states individually. For Russia, it's much better if the US leadership is discredited and in low esteem. For Russia, it's much better if the United States withdraws from conflict zones, as it did in Syria, which emboldened the regime. And also to drive a wedge in NATO. And I don't know whether you have seen the recent documentary on Arte, where Bolton, the former national security advisor to President Trump, said how close it was for President Trump to put the question of further existence of NATO on the table. In the 19th century, the map in Europe was a map of empires. You had the Russian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you had a kind of German Empire, and France and Spain and Britain were still empires. All these empires are now dissolved, except maybe one, which is Russia. And the problem with empire is that empire basically is a setup of relations among non-equals. If you have relations with non-equals, then also the rule of law is not to be applied. For Russia, the fundamental problem is, if Ukraine is successful, and with the historical ties in mind between Russia and Ukraine, nobody could argue anymore that this wouldn't also be the proper way for Russia to develop in the future. This is a fundamental danger for the current regime and would destabilize the country. But we've also seen China, especially in the last weeks, to be aggressive in Hong Kong, putting into danger the agreement with the United Kingdom. We know about the Uyghurs. We see increasing military pressure on Taiwan. We see increasing political pressure on Australia. So I think Henry Kissinger has said that China's development now, since he accompanies it, is in the third phase. There was the Mao-Nixon phase, Could also maybe say the Kissinger phase, but he's probably too polite to call it like that. There was the Deng Xiaoping phase, where the most important thing was that the cat was catching mice, whether it was black or whether it was white. And now, obviously, we have again entered into a new phase with Xi Jinping. And that has led many to describe the relationships anew, not mainly determined by business interests, but describing that relationship as a relation among partners, competitors, but also strategic rivals. So to sum it up, I think it would be a fair conclusion to state that the geopolitical question is back. So the geopolitical question is basically who is dominating Eurasia. But with the difference that this time, the leading country, which is China, is not only increasingly strong militarily, it's strong economically, it has leading edge technologies, and it's 1 billion people. So obviously, the competition for number one status is much more fierce than we have known it historically, and also much more open in outcome. The Biden administration is trying to respond with an alliance of democracies. So it's re-evaluating the necessity for partners and allies. A new relationship with India is trying to be established. But there's also a fundamental weakness. The fundamental weakness is that in the United States, the party of government regularly changes. So it's very important that both main parties in the United States are convinced of those necessities for alliances. So what does it mean for the EU? I think Brexit has told us that the European Union is only as strong as its weakest link, because it's bringing together 28, now 27 member states. The weakest link in terms of public opinion was obviously the United Kingdom, and that weakest link broke. It shows that the European Union, therefore, is dependent on popular support. And it's more important nowadays than ever when the geopolitical struggle, in fact, has moved into cyberspace. So how do we cope? First, I think it's positive that the European Union, again, has very clear and understandable and communicable priorities, which are digital, climate, the fight against COVID, and strategic sovereignty. Important decisions have been taken. Maybe it has escaped attention, but the budget over the next 7 years de facto has been reduced from 1% of GDP to 2% of GDP. So it has doubled. This was a decision to support the member states in their fight, but which has a dimension which most of us would have thought impossible not very long ago. Secondly, to a certain extent, we could say that the leadership of the European Commission with Ursula von der Leyen has very strong support. We remember that maybe the strongest phase of the European Union was under Jacques Delors, where it was a French minister who took over the leadership of the European Commission with very strong German support. And now we have a German minister taking over the leadership of the European Commission, but with extremely strong backing from France. It's also true that the parliamentary majority of the Commission has rather broadened from the moment of election to now. So what does it all mean? It means we are in a heightened situation of system rivalry. Can be analyzed, of course, in very different ways. But one thing is also clear. We cannot go back to a system of non-cooperation and lose 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years. Climate change is simply too important that we can afford to non-cooperate on major issues, and I'm just mentioning one of the major issues. That means we cannot just think in simple analogies to the Cold War. We have to establish an agenda of cooperation. We have to dare to talk. We have to dare to communicate. We have to dare to negotiate. And that's in fact what Henry Kissinger did when, against all odds, he went to China to prepare for a strategy of cooperation and dialogue. Thank you very much.